was afraid after 2 days of meetings in Orlando I might be talked out, but I got plenty of stuff to say. Who said as usual? I bring you greetings from Orlando, all our sisters and brothers in the United Church of Christ of the Florida Conference. Received a letter today, it must have come in yesterday's mail, from our sister church in Sanibel. And in the letter they tell us that they pray each week for 2 congregations in the Florida Conference. And this week they prayed for us. Aww. It's wonderful to be part of such a vibrant church, and I was going to share some of what I didn't sleep through this weekend. I did actually nod off in a session that Gene Simpson was leading, but don't tell her that, and we will tell her not to listen to this on the internet. Because God chose you. Have you ever really thought about that? God chose you. God chose each and every one of us. And we read that in this second letter of Paul to the Thessalonians. It was kind of written and kind of followed pretty quickly on the first one. We think it was written around 51 AD. And it was a time when people had kind of been led astray. They were really being persecuted very heavily in this church at the time. And they had also misinterpreted something Paul had said to them, and they thought that Jesus' return was imminent. So they were quitting their jobs. And so there's actually a part of the letter that says, get back to work. You're not done. So we didn't read that part today, but keep that in mind, that part of today's message is, get back to work. We're not done. So that is part of today's message. But this part that we read, I think, offers, they talk about it offering correction. Paul trying to correct people's misconceptions. But I think it offers us some comfort as well as we think about that. Pray in thanksgiving for calling. Prayer is important. Give thanks for the church's members calling and how we pray for one another. That's the message of what we read today. This past week we sort of finished the book study we've been doing on Elizabeth Lester's Broken Open. And one of the lines we used to end the session was this one. No one's presence is arbitrary. Everyone is essential. And so I think that's just so appropriate as we think about God chose us. God chose us to be church here together this morning and beyond this morning. And no one is here arbitrarily or by accident. Everyone here is essential. I thought about that, and I thought, I think that's part of Paul's message today. We had the opportunity this weekend to listen to Ron Buford, who's the man who created the God is Still Speaking message that came out of the United Church of Christ probably about 3 or 4 years ago now. Do you remember the bouncer commercial that showed on TV? Mm-hmm. It was actually banned by CBS and NBC initially. And instead of letting it just be banned, they fought it, and they got it on TV, and it got on a lot of the cable stations. I remember seeing it. It was before Faith Family was the United Church of Christ. And I looked at that, and I went, wow, that's the kind of church I want to be part of. Because they have 2 bouncers standing there. And they have those little cords they put across, like the movie theaters or something. And people would walk up and they'd go, nope, not you. Nope, not you. Nope, not you. And they'd let in people that looked a lot like themselves and these kind of lovely heterosexual couples. But they looked like themselves and they didn't look like everybody else. And so a man in a wheelchair was kept out. And 2 men holding hands were kept out. And a number of other people were kept out. And at the end of the commercial, it says, Jesus didn't reject anyone. And neither do we. The United Church of Christ, God is still speaking. And I remember seeing that and I thought, boy, that's the church. That's the one that speaks to my heart. And we had speak to us, and I was privileged to hear him both Friday and Saturday, Ron Buford, who created that whole message. And one of the things he said yesterday was, as everyone else gets down in the world and down on the world, that is not our message. We are Easter people in a Good Friday world. We are Easter people in a Good Friday world. And if you listen closely to our Alleluia today, it's an Easter Alleluia. Give thanks to the risen Lord. I thought about this, and I thought about how we are called to be and to spread the good news. The good news. And I thought about it because I was thinking back on how my weekend had opened in the various committees on which I sit in United Church of Christ. And the very first meeting I was in, the person in charge of community building decided the way we would build community is we would catch each other up on what's happened in our lives in our churches since our last meeting, which was about a month ago. And so one person got up and who was a pastor and said, well, I've got to hire new staff, and it's just so hard, and I'm just being grumpy pastor. And I'm sitting there thinking, wonder what it's like to have to hire new staff. What's that like? And somebody else got up and was all upset because their homeowners association was going to buy a golf course, and they just didn't have the money to do that. And I'm going, what's that like to buy a golf course? Another person who couldn't be there, one of the pastors, and asked you to pray for him. His wife is seriously ill with cancer. She had responded initially to some therapy, but is not responding now. And so they were calling him a grumpy pastor too, and I thought, boy, if he's a grumpy pastor, he has a reason to be a grumpy pastor. I can't imagine what it would be like to have that. And someone else was sharing that, the new office they were opening was behind schedule. It wouldn't be able to open on time, and so now it would have to be put off till after the holidays, and it couldn't open until January. And I'm like, okay. So then it was my turn. And I thought, I can whine as good as anybody else can whine. But you know what? All the stuff that's going on here, I just said, we have a most amazing community. And when one of us slips and falls down, somebody else is there to reach down a hand and help them up. And I spoke about some of the things that were going on here and how we continue to build the small church that we are. And I thought, I really was thinking to myself, I really can whine with the best of them if I want to. But somehow, I guess I knew Ron Buford was going to say yesterday, we are Easter people in a Good Friday world. I thought, And then the next meeting I go to, I'm listening to people and they're praying. And they're praying in gratitude for different things. So one person prays because her boyfriend gave her an oil change so that her car was safe for her to come to the meeting. And I thought, well, that's okay. And somebody else prayed because she had a long drive and she made it safely and she thought that was a good thing. And somebody else said the same thing. And then somebody said, well, I pray because they have a new condo and it's close to where I work and I'm really happy about that. And then it was my turn. And I thought, are they really getting the message here? And I said, I give thanks because in our congregation, we have a grandson who is 4 years old, who has stage 4 metastatic cancer. And no matter what happens to him in his day, in his life, any time I've ever seen him, all he does is smile. Amen. And it changed the tone of the meeting. It changed the tone. And then that afternoon, I went to a meeting where Ron Buford was leading it. And it was for people, it was for pastors who want to lead new churches, transitional churches. They want to be interim pastors and help a church as it gets to be, as it's looking for a settled pastor. And I share that with you so you know that I'm looking for another job. No, I'm kidding. I share that with you because I called, Gene Simpson was leading it with Ron Buford, and it was another friend of mine, Dick Sparrow, and I said, can I sit in? Is there something that would be helpful there for me to hear as the pastor of a new church start? And she said, oh yeah, come on, just sit in. And so I go there after these other two experiences, and the first question, Ron Buford says, okay, I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to go around the room. Everybody's going to answer this question. And the first question was, talk about a time you felt near death. I thought, well, this is certainly uplifting. And by then, I was dragging. I was really kind of dragging. We'd been up since 5, and by the end of that session, it ended at 5, and about 4:45, I did one of these. I felt really bad because Gene was speaking at that time, but anyway. So everybody spoke about some experience that felt near death to them. And some of them were physical. A lot of people have these near-death experiences or these out-of-body experiences. I mean, they really had them. One of the pastors talked about being diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, and they had rushed her through and they were going to do surgery. And she had gone to, I forget what church, and they never laid hands in that church, but the pastor said to her that day, can we lay hands on you? I feel called to lay hands. And she said, well, why not? So they laid hands on her, and she had surgery on Monday. And there was no cancer. I'd mentioned to you who that pastor was, but she'd be upset. Know that she's been here, and she's the first person you guys applauded for and haven't stopped applauding since. I'm not quite sure why. But anyway, and there were stories like that that went around the room. The next question Ron Buford asked us to answer was, talk about a time when you felt most alive. And people talked about being pastors, and they talked about their experiences of preaching and their experiences of teaching. And they talked about a whole bunch of other things. They talked about flying, being in planes where they were, the pilot, and they talked about surfing, and they talked about a whole bunch of different things. And they were all pretty cool and pretty amazing. I talked about the day that I left the convent. And I felt a little funny saying this with Ron Buford there, but I said, I really had this sense of being free, like free at last, thank God I'm free. And that's how I felt, but it was a positive experience for me. And we all talked about it, and then, I told my usual story about that and we laughed. But so that was the second question we all had to answer. Then the third thing we had to do was we had to, Gene Simpson was our scribe, so a lot of things were spelled wrong. Don't tell her I said that. and so she had written all these things on, how we write them on those big sheets of paper. And so Ron Buford had gone through and he had circled what he thought were the significant or important words. And then he asked us to go up and circle anything else that we thought was significant or important. So we all did. We sat back down. He goes, okay, now I want you to get up and I want you to frame a vision statement from a church, for a church, based on the words that are on these papers, and you have to do it in 7 words or less.
Whoa.
Okay? Here's the list I chose from. These are the words I wrote down. Oppression, abandonment, grief, revolution. The near-death experience was Gene Simpson's. That was about revolution. She was in Iran during its revolution, giving birth to one of her daughters. And that was her near-death experience. But anyway, so that's where revolution came from. Birth, children, flying, new life, in parentheses, green card, because that was the new life somebody had gotten, was from having a green card. Preach, hope, and resurrection. So I went and I looked at those this morning at 5 o'clock, and I wrote them all down, and I said, okay, these are the words I worked from. And then we could work from words that made us think of that. So like it might be God this, God that. So I use spirit. So here are my 7 words. Spirit births us into life without abandonment. Spirit births us into life without abandonment. Why? Because God chose us. God chose us. And so the whole weekend was coming together for me, that we are resurrection people in a Good Friday world. That's who we are. There's a lot of pain in this congregation. There's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of fright and fear. There's a lot of stuff going on for a lot of people here. And you heard that in our prayer earlier. I'm not making it up. I don't have to. All these things are real. Some of them spoken, many of them yet unspoken to us. And that's okay. Did I mention they had free happy hour on Friday night? I haven't been the same since then. Ron Buford said yesterday, he spoke to us in the morning, and then he spoke to us in service. He was our preacher that afternoon. And he talked about the United Church of Christ. And he said, I looked at our history and I said, the United Church of Christ, quote, 400 years of raising hell. That's what the United Church of Christ is, because the United Church of Christ for 400 years has stood up to things like slavery, has stood up to things like homophobia, has stood up to any issue you can imagine in its day, and said, no, we won't be part of that problem. We will only be part of the solution and relationship. And he went on to talk about the Great Commandment. And he said, you know, Bible scholars say it's not inappropriate to translate the word that we use for commandment as relationship. So the Great Commandment is about relationship. To love God with all that we are. And to love one another as we have been loved. The Great Commandment, the great relationship. That's what we're about. We're the church of the Great Commandment, he said. And I'm sitting in my little chair, not asleep, thinking, what did we put in to our vision statement when we sat there the very first month of being Faith Family? The Great Commandment. The Great Commandment that is about relationship. That's what Faith Family United Church of Christ has always been about. One of the other things Ron said yesterday was, hearts can't be unbroken. Hearts can't be unbroken. But he said, we can offer a ministry of accompaniment that offers hope. And what do we say all the time about Jesus, who is our Christ? He accompanies us every single step of the way. No step on our journey, no pace that we take, no misstep or fall that we have, do we do without Jesus being there with us. God is still speaking. God is not finished with us. God is not finished with this church. God is not finished with our world. I don't know if you know this, but Ron reminded us yesterday that God is still speaking comes from never place a period where God has placed a comma. And he discovered that when he was in a kind of a funky little store in one of the cities. I don't remember what city it was. Anybody remember in California?
San Francisco.
San Francisco. Oh, well, of course it was San Francisco. Yeah. So he's in San Francisco, and he walked into the store, and it's got postcards, and he found 2 Gracie Allen postcards. And he goes, and people are saying to me, why didn't I choose Bonhoeffer? Or why didn't I choose Bultmann? And why didn't I choose all these other great theologians to come up with this God is Still Speaking series? No, I found it in a quote from Gracie Allen, and that's what it is. And Gracie Allen wrote in a it was a postcard that he found, but it was a note that she wrote to be opened after her death because she knew that her husband George Burns would not do well without her. And so she wrote to him, never place a period where God has placed a comma, George, to help him be accompanied on that part of his journey where she couldn't accompany him. And then he said, there's another postcard I found that day by Gracie Allen. And I said this, what did I say to you earlier? God isn't finished with us. Yes, we have much work yet to do. That's Thessalonians. Okay? Here's the second quote. You can't make footprints in the sand while you're sitting on your butt. Okay? So that's what we need to remember too. So I think what we need to think about this day and every day as Faith Family is we need to get off our butts and raise some hell, because that's what the United Church of Christ does in this world. And one of the things he reminded us was this is probably the most important thing that we need to do. To not sit on our butts until all the hungry are fed, until all the naked are clothed, until all the sorrowing and sorrowful are comforted, and until all the sick are healed. That is our God. That is what we believe. That is who we are as the Raise Hell Faith Family United Church of Christ. This day and always.